Welcome to Philosophy 3 Aesthetics, the Philosophy of Art. This video will be an introduction to the content that we will cover in our course. You will be introduced to many ideas in this video that we will cover in more detail later on. Preparing for the lecture quiz. There will be a quick quiz on some of the key ideas covered in these lectures. Here are a few questions that you will want to make sure you can answer by the end of this video and before you start the lecture quiz. Each of these is discussed very briefly, so as long as you understand the basic idea presented here, you should be fine for the quiz. You might want to jot down these questions and answer them as you listen, or it might be more useful to just listen the first time through, and then listen a second time and answer the questions as you listen to prepare for the quiz. Since this is a quick introduction, the questions will be basic and should not require research beyond the lecture. You will cover each topic in more depth as we progress throughout our term. Question 1. What were Plato's worries about art when he wrote the Republic? Question 2. How did Aristotle view the value of tragic plays? How did that differ from Plato? Question 3. What are some key elements of Freudian and Jungian analysis, according to the lecture? Question 4. What is the focus of post-colonial analysis? Question 5. What are some basic concerns of everyday aesthetics? Question 6. What is meant by the term formal analysis? Introduction to Philosophy 3 Aesthetics at Las Positas College. Art has challenged, inspired, and transfixed humans for as far back as human history can be traced. From a scientific perspective, biologists have often wondered why humans create art at all. Most human activities can be traced back to our need to survive, eat, ensure our safety, and create further generations to do the same. But what about art? Any definition of art that tries to reduce art to a simple method of survival, or a courtship ritual, or a way to express dominance hierarchies, seems at the same time to leave out what is most important, challenging, and inspirational about art itself, because its very existence, as well as its effect on us, is so mysterious. What inspires people to give so much in the quest to create authentic art? What inspires us to spend the time we do, investing in stories or sounds or ways of expressing ourselves? When should art count as good art? How should we respond to art? What gives art its value? What does it mean to truly understand the meaning of art? In this class, we will look at many potential answers to these questions as presented by many philosophers, both historical and contemporary. Part 1 of our course, Historical Survey. The first section of our course will be organized historically, making our way through some of the most influential philosophers to discuss the nature, function, value, and dangers of art, focusing specifically on Plato, Aristotle, Kant, Hegel, and Schopenhauer, as well as some central medieval, modernist, and postmodernist thinkers. Plato and Aristotle. Ancient Greek philosopher Plato tells us that in his youth he had planned to be a poet, and Plato discusses Socrates' awe at the poets and their ability to conjure up stories full of wisdom and beauty. At the same time, as Plato approached old age, however, he seemed to worry about the potential harms of art, suggesting in his masterwork, The Republic, that most stories told by poets might need to be censored. He worried that stories of gods acting with immorality and evil people being humanized in sympathetic ways might lure the people away from virtue and encourage them to give into temptation and ignoble acts. Aristotle studied with Plato and later defended art, even the most gruesome tragic plays of ancient Greece, against Plato's attacks. Admitting that the tragedies portrayed tragically flawed characters in sympathetic ways, he argued that we could learn from their downfalls and trajectories how we could avoid their fate ourselves. Even in cases where we identified with the violent and animalistic elements shown on stage, Aristotle argued that we could tell the difference between art and reality, and that identifying vicariously with evil or licentious characters might allow us to purge our own antisocial emotions, draining their power in us and allowing us to live as civil, cooperative, and virtuous persons in everyday life. using movies as art examples. Perhaps it would be worth pulling in some contemporary works of art to illustrate. According to digitaltrends.com, the 3 top grossing films recently were Top Gun Maverick, Avatar: Way of Water, and Black Panther: Wakanda Forever. For a brief and uninspiring summary of these 3 movies, Top Gun Maverick follows a group of fighter pilots in the American Armed Services as they compete for dominance and learn to defend their country. In Avatar: Way of Water, indigenous people in the land of Pandora fight to save their land from colonizers originating from Earth. In Black Panther: Wakanda Forever, the people of Wakanda defend their land against neighboring regimes and outsiders looking to extract rare elements from their world. Plato, at least at the time of the Republic, would likely reject most of this entertainment. Violent sensuality and greed are on display. These traits are sometimes villainized within these movies, but also sometimes lionized. On the other hand, Aristotle would likely appreciate these movies for their ability to teach us about ourselves and to allow us to feel deeply and then purge our irrational impulses as we follow the storylines of tragic characters in these fantastical scenarios. I won't run through each philosopher we plan to cover in this class, but maybe a quick discussion of several of their views will help to orient us to those views and show us where we are headed. Let's take a representative set of these historical philosophers with a quick discussion of how they might approach, critique, and comment on these films. Kant believed that true art was a work of genius beyond human description or understanding. It comes from a special perception of which only artists are capable. Pure beauty relies only on the pure form of shapes and colors at play in our perceptual system, and not on any of the theories we associate with art or any stories we tell about that art. Kant might try to take the sets of Wakanda or Pandora and appreciate their purely visual beauty. Later philosophers known as formalists, such as Clive Bell, expanded on Kant's notion of pure beauty and argued that the only proper way to analyze the aesthetic element of art was to think about the purely physical and sensory aspects of that art, forgetting about anything that the art might represent, and just discussing formal elements of the art, such as line, shape, mass, volume, color, texture, pattern, and repetition within that art. Bell would argue that everything essential about the aesthetic nature of the art could be found in these attributes. In this aspect, Hegel is in many ways the opposite of Kant. The value of art for Hegel is that it tells us stories that help us to think about who we are and what we are as humans, and helps us to understand ourselves amid the progress of history. Hegel would likely appreciate the historical threads linking the stories of Wakanda and Pandora to the Earth's colonial past. And Hegel would likely ask us how we could use these stories to learn from our past and create a future free of colonialism, slavery, cultural domination, and the legacies of these. What Schopenhauer appreciates the most about art is its ability to help us to see the world as a place of beauty that is outside of our desire. The images of beauty can create in us the ability of aesthetic perception, which can transfer even to our everyday life, where life itself becomes an expression of beauty that we can appreciate as a work of art. So that is a quick introduction to the main historical thinkers that we will cover in this course. After covering the historical thinkers, we will start to turn towards general approaches to considering art, most of them from modern sources. Part 2 of our course, Methods of Analyzing Art. The modernists were prominent in the first half of the 20th century. They critiqued art for the waste involved and tried to throw out history in favor of art and design perfectly suited to our human lives. The modernists would likely wonder about the ethical nature of expending so much money and resources purely for entertainment, especially when there are people going hungry in the world and billions of dollars are being used to provide those who already have with even more. The Marxists would likely echo this refrain and condemn the ways in which money and competition for money were taking away the value of art and artists. Marxists like Benjamin might accuse these movies of taking our human cultural heritage and liquidating it in ways that seek nothing more than easy viewership and compounding dollars. Feminists think about the ways in which the inequalities between men and women affect how we create art, and how these depictions affect our society. Feminists like Anne Eaton would likely point to the repeated roles given to men and women, and the ways in which dangerous ideas about beauty and power relations are being reinforced by these movies. Post-colonial thinkers like Paul C. Taylor think a lot about the legacy of dominant cultures who have exploited and marginalized other cultures. Post-colonial thinkers might appreciate the message in Avatar and Wakanda against colonialism, or they might see these movies themselves as ways of exploiting the legacies of already culturally marginalized groups. Freudian thinkers would focus on the close relationships between mothers, fathers, sons, and daughters in all three films, and explain the rest of the fictional scenarios as ways of explaining the basic need for humans to resolve the tensions within their families and upbringings. On the other hand, Jungians would likely focus on the hero of each story and tell us how these heroes represent a quest for the type of wholeness and self-understanding that we all seek as humans. Breaking from most of these approaches is an approach with both ancient and contemporary roots. Champions of everyday aesthetics like Yoriko Saito would encourage us to expand our notion of aesthetics beyond traditional art and to look instead at the beauty and experience that our lives have with everyday objects and everyday acts. Rather than getting lost in the story of the movie showing on our television screen, we might change our focus to observe the experience of watching the film from the everyday environment of our room, the comfortable feeling of being with friends or family as we sit in our familiar space, and the aesthetic of our lives and home, of which the traditional art is but one part. Philosophers thinking about everyday aesthetics argue that being aware of the perceptual experience of everyday objects is just as important as thinking about the things we usually consider to be art. As you can probably see, these ways of understanding art are also ways of understanding the artistic process and thinking about what it means to create art. When we act as artists, we can think of ourselves as coming to know ourselves, bringing beauty into the world, trying to communicate consciousness of societal problems, or just as bringing lines, shape, mass, and volume and color into harmony in ways that cannot be expressed in words. I didn't introduce us to every thinker that we will cover in this class, but I thought it might be valuable to cover a good swath of them to give you a sense of where this course is headed. Each of these thinkers or ways of thinking about art might not make much sense now, but we will be discussing them in depth as we move forward. So don't worry if right now this seems like an overwhelming combination of different ideas. Each one will be explained carefully and exemplified as we move through the semester and cover the textbook readings. At the start of this video, you were asked to look out for a few key thinkers and philosophical perspectives that you would be asked to recall for the quiz. If you don't feel like you have a good idea of how you might answer these questions, you might want to go back and review the video and take some notes on how you would answer them. This is the conclusion of the video introduction to our Philosophy of Aesthetics course.